Osama bin Laden, living in luxury meters away from a military academy in Pakistan, killed by a single American bullet to the head. Now, US-Pakistan relations face an uncertain future, with many in Washington questioning if Islamabad is a reliable ally. Just what impact will this have on the two countries? And will the US ever be able to trust Pakistan in its war against Al-Qaeda? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. The killing by US forces of Osama bin Laden on Pakistani soil has further inflamed tensions between the two nations, a relationship that for years has been marred by mistrust. US counterterrorism chief Paul Brennan said it was inconceivable that bin Laden didn't have some support in Pakistan, a claim strenuously denied by Pakistani authorities. In a statement made on Monday, Pakistan's president said that the war on terrorism was as much Pakistan's war as it was America's. He said, although the events of Sunday were not a joint operation, a decade of cooperation and partnership between the United States and Pakistan led up to the elimination of Osama bin Laden as a continuing threat to the civilized world. And we in Pakistan take some satisfaction that our early assistance in identifying an Al-Qaeda courier ultimately led to this day. Although it may be too early to tell whether it was incompetence or complicity on Pakistan's part, the US's 10-year alliance with the country is now in question. This alliance began in 2001 when the US allied itself to fight in a joint effort against terrorism, namely Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Until recently, Pakistan offered support for US drone strikes in tribal areas, targeting Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders. But intensely unpopular among the Pakistani public, it became a massive strain on the relationship. The US has almost given $20 billion in aid to Pakistan since the 9/11 attacks, mostly in exchange for help in the war on terror. But Pakistan claim they have spent far more than what the US has given them. For more on this, I'm joined by our guests from Islamabad, Omar Warich, a Pakistan-based journalist for the Independent newspaper, and from London, Shiraz Maher, Senior Fellow at the International Centre for Study of Radicalisation at King's College. Welcome. Omar, how can Pakistan be considered a US ally if it was harbouring the man considered public enemy #1 in America?
Well, Jane, that's the question that American officials are asking themselves. In fact, even as we speak right now, Mark Grossman, the special envoy, the US envoy for Afghanistan and Pakistan, is having meetings with Pakistani officials and making it clear to them that they expect them to behave better, are the other words that were described to me by an official who is familiar with that meeting. And they're not prepared to jettison the relationship as yet, but they're certainly reconsidering the terms of it.
Because if you realize what happened preceding this and where he was living, it's like, and this quote is not my own, but I read it earlier on, it's like the police chief in Casablanca saying he was shocked to find gambling in a casino. Do you think Pakistan is complicit here or just utterly incompetent?
Well, the Pakistani intelligence agencies pride themselves on being one of the world's best, having great amount of resources at their hand. They have a huge network of people that stretches right across the country, deep into remote areas of Pakistan. Abbottabad, where I was yesterday, is not one of those remote areas. It has a very strong military presence, even so that actually on the very street that bin Laden was living, there was a retired major general living there as well. The idea that Pakistan didn't know about this seems to strain credulity to a fair extent.
Yeah, you would think with the military there that they'd conduct some sort of checks if they see something the equivalent of Fort Knox going up.
Well, they say that they raided that particular compound in 2003 before bin Laden was there in search of another Al-Qaeda suspect. But their eyes lifted off it since. Again, this is quite troubling. What is obvious, though, is that the US has no doubt in its minds that the Pakistanis knew where he was. So if they didn't know, then they should have given their claims about their own abilities. And if they did know, why were they hiding him?
Okay, Shiraz, I mean, who do you think was responsible for this? Who do you think in the government knew? Was it the Prime Minister? Was it the intelligence services? What do you think is behind this?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I'm not going to make a blanket sort of apology for Pakistan on this, but what I am going to say is that you need to consider sometimes that people who want to go to ground and hide away can do, and they can do it in the heart of America. I want to take you back to 1996 when the Olympic Games were held in Atlanta. There was a bomb attack there, and it was done by a US citizen who lived in America, and he was able to evade capture for 6 years. Now, this is an American who continues to live in that country, who, despite being hunted by the FBI with all their resources on their own terrain, couldn't find their own citizen for almost 6 years. Now, if bin Laden wants to go to ground in Pakistan for 10 years, I don't think it's so inconceivable that he could hide with relevant cover stories, with relevant local support, but not necessarily governmental support. And I think we're rushing to judgment here very, very quickly. I don't want to, as I say, make a blanket excuse for Pakistan. The government has looked two ways in the war on terror from time to time, but I think it does so on a pragmatic basis, and I don't see what they would have to gain by sheltering bin Laden in this way.
Okay, let's try and find out what the US is thinking at the moment. I'm delighted to welcome a US guest. I suspect that traffic was behind your delay. Christine Fair, author and associate professor at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University. Ms. Fair is also a senior fellow with the Counterterrorism Center at West Point. Welcome, Christine. What sort of information do you think the US had ahead of this, and what do you think they've got from the compound? We know that CDs and discs have been taking. Any word on that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, what we're still going through here in D.C. are the questions that your guests have really been thrashing, and that is who in the Pakistan government knew, if there was anyone who actually did know. So what you find going on here in D.C., people are just sort of asking, were the Pakistanis simply inept, or were they complicit? Now, one thing that you do see coming out of D.C. is a much more concerted effort to sort of salvage Pakistan, right? You've had Secretary Clinton say that Pakistan was very much a part of the operation. And so this signals to me that no matter what the answer is to that question, whether it's just ineptitude or complicity, the United States does not have an interest in having a significant rupture with the relationship with Pakistan. And I think that's actually very important to note. It also should let the Pakistanis know that no matter what goes down, the Americans are going to be too afraid to let you completely unravel.
Okay, but if the army was complicit, do you think it'll not provoke America to go it alone in its hunt against the Taliban, therefore increasing drone attacks within Pakistan?
Well, okay, this is an interesting one, right? Because they certainly had a big I gotcha moment when it came with Raymond Davis. This is a much bigger I gotcha moment. And I think it is going to give the Americans much more leeway to prosecute their interests with ever less input and support from the Pakistanis. I think the Americans are certainly going to be much more galvanized to go it alone. And I think the Pakistanis are going to have to pretty much deal with this, because this is a pretty big failure on their part. Remember Faraj al-Libi? He had previously stayed in that house, right? Faraj al-Libi had then subsequently been arrested in Mansehra. Mansehra has a lot of similarities to Abbottabad, except really one huge difference. Abbottabad is practically a cantonment, right? It's a stone's throw away from Kabul, the Pakistan Military Academy. And so it is really going to stretch credulity to the point of breakage to think that someone in that town did not know that something was going on. Some of the interviews with the residents used to joke that the place was, the Waziristan mansion. So clearly, someone knew in that locality that there was something wrong about that house, especially since Faraj al-Libi had previously stayed there.
Let's pop that over to Omar, because you said a little bit earlier on that you had been to the house, and I'm sure that you spoke to people living close by. I mean, did anybody have any contact with him? Did they have any sense that he could have possibly been living there?
Well, there's no one who admitted to ever seeing bin Laden. But I did speak to a construction worker, a man named Riaz Mohammed, who said he lived just 5 minutes away from the house. He said that he had some suspicions about the house and people who'd go into it. He wasn't clear about who owned it. He said it was a Pashtun man named Akbar. I mean, that's all he was able to say about it. But it had, yes, it had raised suspicions for even this man. So I imagine it must have raised suspicions for other people as well.
Okay, Shiraz, let's go back to that point about the US now going it alone if it doesn't feel that it can rely on Pakistan, that Pakistan was complicit. Where's that going to leave the relationship between the two? Because Pakistan has lost quite a lot by aligning itself with the US.
Pakistan has lost quite a lot by aligning itself with the US, and Pakistan's entire nature of its engagement with the US is based on the fact that it's a relationship of pragmatism and self-preservation. Post 9/11, Pakistan realized it had no choice but to work with the Americans and to assist in the prosecution of the war on terror in Afghanistan, and so it did so. But ever since, Pakistan's looking both ways on the matter, I think, is born of increasing fears that one day America will leave Afghanistan, as it did in the 80s when it was giving tacit support to the Mujahideen there. And again, Pakistan's going to be left with this very difficult problem on its doorstep. And I was in Pakistan this time last year. I spent a long time with the military. I traveled with them into the tribal areas, embedded with them, and to see the war on terror from their perspective. And the thing that I got from them all the time was this fact that they feel America is an unreliable partner, that America commits to the region and then cuts and runs, commits again, then cuts and runs.
So it's a pretty scary time then now for those living in Pakistan, isn't it? I mean, if the US is an unreliable ally and they're also preparing for some kind of revenge attacks.
Well, this is the whole point now. Already people are talking about descaling the level of commitment to Afghanistan, talking about pulling out of Afghanistan, but yet you only need to travel through Pakistan's major cities, particularly Islamabad and Lahore, which are slightly different to Karachi. Karachi's always had its problems, but daily bomb attacks now have become a part of life in Islamabad and Lahore. There are military checkpoints all over the city, there are snipers, and so the militarization of society in those places is really starting to affect people. And so from Pakistan's point of view, they're saying, look, we're going to have to absorb this massive problem that is no longer just on their doorstep, it's in their country. The Taliban are operating freely within parts of Pakistan, and they're looking for life beyond the American departure. And the spokesman of the army told me at the time, and I think this is really telling, he said, you cannot expect us to give up our long-term interests for your short-term interests. And regardless of what we think, our interests are going to be time-limited in that region. But Pakistan is in that region, it's stuck there, and so they're taking a much broader perspective on things. And this is where I think the nature of the engagement actually needs to be much stronger. We need to look at this from a pragmatic viewpoint and back the Pakistanis.
Omar, do you think this short-term interest as raised by Shiraz will have some kind of negative impact on the country and that it might lead to some sort of political crisis in the country? I'm hearing that a lot of opposition groups are angry with the government. They believe that the government allowed the US to enter the country, allowed the US to take out Osama bin Laden.
Well, opposition groups have been angry at the government over this for a very long time, and sometimes it's only because they see it politically expedient to express that opposition. I mean, what we've seen over the last 2 days, however, despite the fact going back, you could see Gallup polls register frightening levels of support for Mr. bin Laden. But the reaction has been pretty limited so far. I mean, none of the mainstream parties have really condemned seizing bin Laden. It's been groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, a militant group which offered funeral prayers for him today. The JUI considered it. None of the mainstream parties. The other issue about, there is long simmering discontent about the relationship. And that's because people here who adopt a more nationalist view of things perceive their sovereignty and their pride being trampled on through this relationship with Pakistan. So the bin Laden operation is nothing new in terms of that.
Okay, let's talk about the impact of this bin Laden operation and Hillary Clinton speaking out in what appeared to be an attempt to sort of soothe the relations. She said, the US Secretary of State, that Pakistan had helped in the fight against al-Qaeda. Let's listen in.
Our partnerships, including our close cooperation with Pakistan, have helped put unprecedented pressure on al-Qaeda and its leadership. Continued cooperation will be just as important in the days ahead. Because even as we mark this milestone, we should not forget that the battle to stop al-Qaeda and its syndicate of terror will not end with the death of bin Laden.
Right, so it sounds though she's trying to appease Washington. But Christine, do you think that regardless of that appeasement, lawmakers are going to find it increasingly difficult to justify the $3 billion in aid that the U.S. sends Pakistan every year?
Okay, so that's a difficult issue, and this really intersects with some of my very strong objections to the way in which Mr. Shirazi characterized this relationship. The fact is the United States and Pakistan have engaged when it's been at the intersection of our strategic interests, and our strategic interests have been different. The reason why Pakistan is experiencing the enduring level of violence that it has for the last 10 years is in part because Pakistan has chosen to use militant groups as its tool of foreign policy. There would be no Pakistani Taliban if there were no Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Sip-e-Saib-e-Pakistan. So this is called blowback. And what I find very dangerous in the interpretation that Pakistan is experiencing this level of violence because the U.S. abandoned it is a complete lack of appreciation as to how Pakistan arrived where it is as a consequence of the strategic decisions that it's made. Now, Washington, of course, very much appreciates the fact that Pakistan has chosen to use militant groups as its tool of foreign policy, its tool of choice. Now, not for one decade, but in fact, since Pakistan came into existence in 1947, right? The tribal Lashkars that went into Kashmir, that was sort of one of the first opportunities where this tactic was employed. So what you're going to find in Congress is a creeping exasperation that groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba continue to freely operate in Pakistan, as you've seen.
Okay,
Lashkar-e-Taiba / Jamaat al-Dawa is the one, putting out protests in favor of bin Laden and offering his death prayer. So that's where this problem is really going to come to the breaking point in Congress. Is
okay,
that
let's get that from
continue
Shiraz.
to see these groups operating with impunity. No, you did give Shiraz quite a bit. I think it's fair to introduce the corrective narrative here. This isn't poor Pakistan, poor boo-boo. This is Pakistan reaping the whirlwind of decades
okay, I think we get that, Christine. Let me just pop that over to Shiraz. Why do you think Pakistan continues to support these groups? What's it trying to achieve?
As I said before our belated guest in DC arrived, that I'm not going to make blanket excuses for Pakistan, nor am I in any way necessarily apologizing for what it's doing. All I'm saying is you need to look at this from their perspectives, because if we're going to be in the position of wanting to influence behavior in Pakistan, we need to understand what's motivating them. And in that context, I've never thought, and I think it's absurd to think that Pakistan is ideologically aligned with the Taliban or with Al-Qaeda. But of course Pakistan has used jihadist groups in what it calls to provide it with strategic depth against what it regards to be its biggest threat in the region, India, and to counterbalance India's regional dominance. Now, in that context, of course Pakistan has used these groups, and Pakistan is now having to, in the post-9/11 climate, tackle them. But let's not forget, the US, if not offering direct, certainly offered tacit support to the Mujahideen in the 1980s as well. All countries have used these groups when it conflates with their national strategic interests. And Pakistan, in its case, that strategic interest continued beyond the end of the Soviet Union in a way that it ended for the Americans at that phase. So the idea that somehow America can just totally wash its hands of what's happening there, I'm afraid, is an absolute derogation of duty and a denial of the reality of what's happening.
No one actually said that.
And this is the broader prospect. Sorry, you need to consider this. You need to consider this too in the region, is that again, when I spoke to Pakistani government officials, senior-ranking army people when I was there, the point they were making is that if they had to pick between a superpower in the world at this moment, they would go with, and do have, a long-standing relationship with China. China's the regional superpower. And so, again, if you want to talk about America's strategic interests, you need to consider that Pakistan could be lost permanently to the Chinese. And I think that is a far more dangerous prospect than anything the jihadist groups could ever do.
I'd like Omar to pick up on this point about Pakistan having harbored Osama bin Laden for so long. Do you think Pakistan may be viewed as bearing sort of indirect responsibility for attacks post 9/11?
Well, in some cases it obviously does. I mean, for example, if you look at the phenomenon of the Pakistani Taliban, It all started when a militant, a former ISI asset known as Abdullah Masood, kidnapped two Chinese engineers. To deal with that situation, the Pakistanis then propped up this former bus driver known as Baitullah Masood. Baitullah Masood later became the head of the Pakistani Taliban and is implicated in the murder of, is blamed for the murder of Benazir Bhutto. If you look at other situations as well, like, for example, the peace deals that were cut in South Waziristan and in Swat. After 2005 Saragossa agreement, Baitullah Masood was able to lure the militants from Swat, provide them with training alongside Central Asian fighters, brutal Uzbeks. They subsequently returned to Swat. The Musharraf regime took no action against Maulana Fazlullah in that area for a very, very long time. In fact, until as late as November 2007, even then with only limited operations, crude artillery fire that didn't target the militants and actually alienated the army more so there. And then subsequently in 2009, they actually signed a peace deal which allowed and they signed up Sufi Muhammad, who is a known militant, considered an anti-state element by Pakistanis up to that point, enlisted him in their support, allowed at least for 6 weeks the Taliban in Swat to have free reign. They went into areas like Bunair. So I think there's ample examples of very bad decisions made by the Pakistani establishment where it has come to militant groups and it's come back to hit them really hard.
Christine, do you think Osama bin Laden's successor, if it's not going to be the Egyptian Ayman Zawahiri, is likely to come from Pakistani groups?
You know, honestly, I'm not in a position to make any judgment on that issue. I think the points that Omar Warich made are absolutely spot on. I mean, he nailed every single major mistake in judgment that Pakistan has made in the last several years. With respect to Zawahiri, the issue is, of course, he's been the operational leader for quite some time. The problem is he doesn't have that he doesn't have the charisma of bin Laden, and I don't know who would really be able to replace bin Laden from that respect, and I certainly don't want to speculate. But I did want to go back to this point that Shirazi made about the deadly embrace of the United States and Pakistan, because one of the narratives that is just historically inaccurate that goes through this entire discussion is somehow that it was the American jihad in Afghanistan. And anyone who's actually looked at the history of Pakistan's engagement in Afghanistan would know that that's simply it's historically false. Pakistan actually began its policy in Afghanistan as early as 1973. And it was, in fact, Zia that had to persuade President Carter about the logic of the jihad. So in some sense, this was Zia's baby that the Americans were sort of brought along into. And the reason why I'm stressing this is that far too often in Pakistan, Pakistanis want to put all of this history on the perfidious Americans. Now, I will never exculpate the very bad decisions that my country has made with respect to the region. But I think it's absolutely important that Pakistanis need to hold their government to account for the decisions that they have made that's resulted in the death of thousands of Pakistanis. By my calculation, approximately 35,000 Pakistanis have died from Islamist violence since 9/11. That is a huge number, 35,000.
Okay, you were talking about the toxic relationship between the US and Pakistan, if I can describe it as that. How do you think this can change, and is it possible for it to change, or is this just a relationship of relative convenience at the moment?
I think it's very profound. It's not a relationship of convenience. Often this gets called a trust deficit, and I'm convinced that's not what it is. It's really a certitude surplus, right? The Americans and the Pakistanis know that our respective allies and enemies are the allies and enemies of the other, right? So the Pakistanis, and I was a huge critic of the Indo-US nuclear deal and remain so. So I think when the Pakistanis say, look, You Americans know that India is our enemy, and during the time of our support to your global war on terrorism, you give the Indians a nuclear deal. How is that supposed to resonate amongst Pakistanis, right? So in the same way that right now the Americans are saying, you know, Jesus, criminally, bin Laden is up the street from Kakul, the Pakistan Military Academy. Pakistanis are also saying, we have lost 3,000 troops, and you go and give the Indians a nuclear deal. Mr. Shirazi spoke about China. That's a total joke. China's never helped Pakistan in any war, not a single one.
And you wonder how much of this has got to do with India. But let's leave it on that question because we have, unfortunately...
It has everything to do with India.
Sadly, we've run out of time because, yeah, a lot of people think that that's what drives it all here. Christine Fair, thanks for joining us. Omar Warich and Shiraz Maher. And thank you, of course, for watching this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.